Thank you for joining us today for the embargoed release of the 1990-1991 Cabinet records. Now, before the official proceedings begin, I'd like to take a few moments to tell you about the conditions for the embargoed release. But even before I do that, can I just mention that you may be recording from your mobile device. That's fine, but can you turn it off to silent, just in case the device might ring at an impromptu moment. So firstly, I'd like to advise you that from November next year, 2016, many of the original records held by the National Archives will be in the process of being relocated to our new preservation and storage facility, which is currently under construction in Canberra. Now, this is a massive logistical operation which involves transferring around 15 million records from our existing repositories in Canberra, we have two, along with selected AV material from Sydney, out at Chester Hill. So this state-of-the-art repository will ensure the ongoing preservation of the collection and, along with other storage upgrades in Canberra and Sydney, secures the National Archives' capacity to accept paper records until 2031, but also expands our digital storage. Our online records during this period will remain available, and original records in our other state and territory offices will also be accessible during the period of relocation. Further information regarding details of the relocation dates and impact on our access services will be provided over the coming months. So, to the embargo arrangements for today. Firstly, this briefing is for accredited members of the media, members of the National Archives Advisory Council, and this year representatives from our host venue, the New South Wales State Library. The embargo applies not only to the Cabinet records and the online information which we'll provide today, but also to everything you hear at this morning's event. A significant requirement is that you acknowledge in your coverage the National Archives of Australia as custodian of the Cabinet records. You will find the expected wording in the online media guide, which will be made available to you later today. As usual, we have provided contextual information about the records, as well as the selection of key Cabinet papers made by our guest historian, Professor Nicholas Brown. The National Archives is also recording this event today, which will be podcast on our website from 1 January 2016. Just to make sure you've all signed your embargo release document, or you've put your name on the line. Fantastic. And of course, you're all happy to be recorded in the event today. Yes, okay. So to the Cabinet records, and with the gradual implementation of the 20-year access rule, we now have 2 years of Cabinet records coming into the open period each year. Through this process, this transitional process, it's also become impossible to proactively access, clear and release under embargo all Cabinet documents that become available in that 2-year period. So there's an estimated 2,575 records held by the National Archives for the 1990 and 1991 Cabinets. And we've noticed in the past that media, that you, have featured stories based on only a very small proportion of the total records released. So for the past few years, we've asked for your help to identify the topics you see as most interesting. We provided media outlets with embargoed lists of records earlier this year. Many of you took the time to identify those you saw as having the best potential for a good story or even a great story. And I'd like to thank you, all of you and others not in the room today, who participated in that process. Next year, particularly with this move to our new repository, we'll be asking you to participate in the selection process. We'll approach you in February, but we're going to ask you to cover 2 years' worth, so in fact 4 cabinets for 2017 and 2018. And I know you all have enormous pressures on your time, but I would like to urge you to take the opportunity to identify records that you would like to have cleared for these forward embargoed briefings. So the documents we are releasing today under embargo include almost 300 decisions, submissions and memoranda selected from the total this year. Out of those documents, a very small amount of material has been withheld from public access, and that is very similar to the last few years. We are pleased that we have been able to make available almost all of the records which you requested earlier in the year. Records from the cabinets of 1990 and 1991, which are not available as part of this embargoed release, which includes the remaining submissions, memoranda and decisions, and the Cabinet Office files, will be eligible for access requests on application from 1 January 2016, along with departmental files that give further background to many of the issues considered by Cabinet during that period that are not part of today's embargoed release. How are we bringing this to you? Again, this year we're providing you with embargoed online access to the Cabinet records. I understand that you've been able to, over the last couple of years, download the information with ease or relative ease. And we've had feedback from a number of you that you found it helpful to have online searchable access to the records. So thank you for that assistance. The first online file is a list of content and instructions, and we suggest you read this first. You will also find the media guide, which contains Professor Brown's paper giving an overview of 1990 and 91. And we've provided a hard copy of that for you today. Also, along with the conditions of the embargo and contact details, which is available online. We suggest you download these two documents first. The historian's selection includes a list of documents that are of special interest to him, which you'll also be able to download. You'll find a list of all 299 records that have been access examined for this embargoed briefing, and searchable PDF copies of the documents that have been opened. Another online file includes the titles of submissions and memoranda for 1990 and 1991 Hawke Cabinets in numerical order, by subject and by the state or territory to which each relates, as well as a numerical listing of decisions. As always, we've provided on our website high-resolution images, some of which you've seen scrolling through a little earlier, and captions from the period, which you can also download. You'll find the link to the media showcase in your online media guide. The selected records made available to you electronically from today will be available to the public from 1 January 2016, when digital copies of these submissions, memoranda and decisions are loaded onto our online database record search. This will provide all Australians, or in fact others across the world who are interested, wherever they live, with access to these records from their personal computers. It now gives me great pleasure to invite David Fricker, Director General of the National Archives of Australia, to introduce our special guests.
Those of you I haven't met yet, I'm David Fricker, the Director General of the National Archives of Australia. And I do extend a very special welcome to you all, but also our very special guests here today, Mr. Bob Hawke, AC, and Professor Nicholas Brown. And also, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which this great library has been constructed, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend a very special welcome to Mr. Andrew Tink, AM, President, Library Council of New South Wales. It's a really great honour to be here in your institution today, and it's very generous of you to allow us to be here. So thank you very much, Andrew. And through you, I also extend my appreciation to Alex Byrne, New South Wales State Librarian and Chief Executive, for providing this fantastic venue to host this year's Cabinet Release Briefing. The yearly release of Cabinet records, of course, is a very exciting time for us at the Archives. It's a major day on our calendar. not only because it will fill the papers on the 1st of January, and it's great to see so much use of archival material, but behind that, though, for us, it's an annual reminder to the people of Australia of why the National Archives exists. And the reason we exist is to make sure that the essential evidence of what the government does and what the government departments and agencies do is preserved. That evidence is preserved, and one day all of that evidence will see the light of day. And so what we do is we maintain the accountability and the transparency of government, and it's an absolute underpinning of Australia's system of democracy, and so it's a great moment for us to reflect upon that. And it doesn't matter the classification, as we'll see out there, it doesn't matter how highly classified the information is, how sensitive the information is, or indeed how embarrassing the information is, it will one day see the light of day, and I think that's a really important aspect of Australia's system of government and democracy. But now, it's not about me, it's about our two guests today. So I'd like to welcome them both. Of course, former Prime Minister, the Honourable Bob Hawke AC, and our own consultant historian, Professor Nicholas Brown from the Australian National University. They're both going to give you an insight this morning into the political world of 90 and 91. And of course, we are especially grateful to you, Mr Hawke, for making time to be with us today. Professor Brown will summarise the political landscape of the time, whereas Mr Hawke, of course, is going to share his insights into what actually went on and what went on behind the records that we're going to see. But first to Nicholas Brown. He's a professor in the School of History, College of Arts and Social Sciences at the Australian National University. He's published extensively in Australian political, environmental and social history, including most recently a history of Canberra, and with Susan Bowden, A Way Through, the life of Rick Farley. He has chapters in the Cambridge History of Australia and a companion to the Australian media. From 2002 to 2004, he was the Keith Cameron Professor of Australian History at University College Dublin, and has previously worked in the Departments of Defence and Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's currently the head of School of History at the ANU and collaborating in an ARC-supported biographical study of the Australian economist Sir John Crawford. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Professor Nicholas Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think you probably want to get me out of the way fairly quickly so we can move on to the main act. So I'll go straight into my remarks reflecting on the essay that I provided for you today. The years covered by this release of Cabinet records almost exactly map the tenure of the fourth Hawke Labor government. They're sharply defined by the election of that government, called in February, held in March 1990, and won to the surprise of many of its members. And then by the leadership spill which saw Paul Keating's succession to the Prime Ministership on the 20th of December 1991. We are now accustomed to such corrections. I think it is worth pausing to reflect on the relative shock of such a transition at that time, even among those who engineered it. In between, there is perhaps a familiar story played out in contemporary public reporting and in the autobiographical reflections and political histories which have appeared since. The spilling of bitter cabinet conflict over telecommunications policy, for example, into the headlines of August 1990, quoting ministers and departmental views on, quote, McEwenism at its very worst. There is Paul Keating's unguarded concession in November 1990 as Treasurer that Australia was, you don't need me to repeat it, in a recession we had to have. There are the fraught debates in public over what could still define Labor values on issues ranging from privatisation to welfare provision. There was Australia's commitment in January 1991 to what we now see in retrospect as the first Gulf War, and a new calculus of international security in the final ebb of the Cold War. There is the rallying of the opposition behind John Hewson's Fight Back manifesto, and all the while the rumble of leadership speculation as the Kirribilli Agreement became public in May 1990, and Paul Keating's first challenge for the top job came in July 1991. You don't need me to tell that story again, and I'm probably not the one here today you want to hear it from. But my job is to review the internal workings of Cabinet, or at least the extent to which they're disclosed in selected Cabinet records, rather than that public narrative, to set that in context. And the background essay you have from me does that at some length. Surprising length, perhaps, I have to concede that even for myself, for a reason that became evident to me as I worked over the papers. My basic point is there is an element of disconnect between Cabinet business in the years 1990 to 1991 and that prevailing political narrative that I've just summarised. In Bob Hawke's own memoirs, the chapter devoted to his fourth term is titled Making History, and openly deflects arguments that his government in that fourth term was paralysed in this period by economic challenges and internal disharmony. His insistence is that this fourth term was, in fact, crucial to entrenching the program of structural reform and reconstruction which had driven the government since 1983. The records made available to you today will, I'm sure, prompt consideration of this proposition, whether in terms of the major reaffirmation of the ending of industrial protection, of the practices of enterprise bargaining introduced under Accord Mark 6, of more closely targeted social welfare provision, each of which I will come back to soon. And it's undeniable that, in terms of a legislative program, in those 2 years, Parliament passed more acts than any of its predecessors since Federation, as Bob points out in his chapter. This is not paralysis. 144 pieces of legislation in 1990, 204 in 1991. Again, the Cabinet papers reflect some of this activity and might even provide some justification for the length of my essay, a very selective profile of which I can offer now. It is also remarkable that much of the press coverage, even at that time, tended to see this activity as a reflection of a government seeking to revive flagging fortunes, to find new ideas with an eye to the polls and drifting constituencies, to move beyond political bluster and convince a society that was, by many accounts, by then, worn, dispirited, anxious after a near decade of transformation. How fair that assessment was is, to some extent, again, over to you. But my reading of the papers suggests 3 main points you might want to consider in judging that. I want to deal with those 3 points under the headings. First, what was meant by the increasingly tight focus on microeconomic reform through the period 1990-1991? Second, what was the impact of the recession on government policy and Cabinet discussions? And third, in what ways did this period see decisive changes in Australia's political landscape? 3 headings, let me move into them. First, central to the agenda of this fourth term was a determination to bed down commitments to microeconomic reform that had built within the government since 1983. The term microeconomic is everywhere, ubiquitous in the papers. When I spoke about the last tranche of papers, 1988-89 last year, structural adjustment was the term that seemed to come up over and over again. It's microeconomic reform that is so central to the papers from this period. A touchstone, a way of evoking the subject of policy disaggregated out into the costs and optimising behaviour of economic agents. The stage for this had clearly been set since 1983 in the floating of the dollar, the Accord process, the programmes of deregulation, the phasing out of protection. Entering its 3rd term in 1987, the government more precisely coordinated its attention to microeconomic policies, priorities, in a substantial reorganisation of its portfolios and committee processes. Now, with the re-election in 1990, the focus needed to turn more tightly to the workers, employers and institutions that had increasingly to play their part in transforming the world of work in the Australian nation. In the process, the government was to make a decisive break with many of the policy orthodoxies of the past. Cabinet submissions and memoranda coming not only from economic departments but also from welfare and service portfolios narrowed in this period more closely on the bargains to be transacted over workforce participation, workplace culture, transformation and investment, over flexibility, attitudinal change, accountability, to be calculated in price signals, whether in a co-payment for visiting a doctor, the New Start activity test for the unemployed, the thresholds for eligibility for access to childcare, the list goes on. You could have new programs, the government was saying, increasingly bracketed under the broad concept of social justice, but they needed to be more accountable in exacting terms. These were, again, I think the papers suggest, not merely measures for cost recovery in the midst of an increasingly severe budgetary constraint. They were the next crucial stage in a vision of national, social, even subjective transformation proposed for Australian citizens, systems and practices. Such a focus on microeconomic reform in itself led to a feature of cabinet business and a characteristic of government in these years. As many critics have argued, process rather than program began to dominate images of the government, allowing critics from both within and with outside cabinet to question directions, priorities and visions, at least to worry over whether the fourth Hawke government ministry was capable of capturing the public imagination to the same extent as its precursors. Microeconomic reform, after all, is not a sexy story to tell to a media. As poor Keating famously put it, addicted to the Punch and Judy show of political gaming. There was more serious business to be transacted, but were people actually interested? But that perhaps easy criticism should not distract from the policy ambitions that had, in several respects, the Prime Minister's own distinctive stamp on them in this period. Among the most prominent of these were the significant drive on what was called then New Federalism, which, I ask you to see Cabinet Submission 7152 of June 1990, instituted a remarkably collaborative Commonwealth State assessment of, quote, activities to reform pricing structures, rationalise workforces, improve profitability and manage assets more efficiently across a wide range of Commonwealth and state activities. And there was also the Better Cities program. I refer you to Submission 7815 of May 1991, which added an ambitious spatial planning and social welfare dimension to, quote, policies relating to microeconomic reform, structural adjustment and environmentally sustainable development. Such syntheses, New Federalism, Better Cities, were big pills to swallow. They wrestled with the tensions between careful targeting and ambitious harmonisation. They challenged some portfolio boundaries. They were always, through this period, short of funding, and they were readily dismissed in the political rough and tumble of the time. Hewson ridiculed a Mad Cities program as offering only better quality pavements for the unemployed to queue upon. And Keating quietly used them to question Hawke's abnegation of what he saw big picture thinking, which for him meant centralised power and no sense of throwing money at a problem. But they were integral components of what microeconomic reform meant and an attempt to change the nation under those big headings of New Federalism and Better Cities. And I think you could argue we have not seen their like since. So that's my first point. What is encompassed under microeconomic reform? Second, the recession itself, coming with that audible snap Don Russell recalls hearing in 1999, no doubt had a marked impact on the conduct of cabinet business. But what impact did it really have on the government's inherent unfolding agenda? The recession can be tracked in Treasury briefing papers, which you have in the papers coming to you today, which begin with Keating noting that the government had the benefit of being re-elected in March, quote, unencumbered by costly and unnecessary campaign promises, and so it could focus on efficiency. 2, midway through 1990, noting unemployment's steep rise from 6% at the start of 1990 towards a peak of 10.8% by late 1991, and as gross domestic product fell by 1.7%. A projected and proudly cultivated budgetary surplus of $8.1 billion was revised for Cabinet to $2.6 billion by December 1990. And Keating then advised ministers in early 1991 that for the medium term at least, discretionary spending will need to be severely constrained and the surplus carefully husbanded. But even with that discipline, the surplus figure was down to $1.7 billion by mid-1991, and the Treasurer then warned colleagues of a deficit of $3 billion for 1991-1992. So that surplus, that proudly cultivated surplus of the previous term, is rapidly shifting away. As Minister for Finance, Ralph Willis counselled Cabinet in February 1991 that, quote, "we must not fritter our reputation away now by relaxing control over outlays, even amid what he conceded was a significant deterioration." Restraint in government programs and policy initiatives had been a mantra of the last tranche of Cabinet papers I reviewed. That notion of restraint intensified through 1990-1991. And it was not until late 1991 that these papers begin to show the restive signs of those within and beyond the government who believed that the dogma of steady retreat from interventionist, stimulatory public policy surely now needed questioning, and who urged instead some measure of stimulus. But through 1990, the recurrent term in submissions, as I note in my essay, is the word pressure. Now is the time to increase pressure by winding back industry assistance for the car industry or the textiles, clothing and footwear sector, or to begin by applying persuasive pressure to the states on service delivery and spending, or to apply to agriculture the same pressure that was being applied to manufacturing, or to share in international operations applying pressure to tyrants such as Saddam Hussein, and equally, as John Dawkins conceded, to respond to the extreme pressure facing the government to ensure that the reforms to higher education of its previous term looked like more than stringency in this term. Pressure is a word that is used over and over again in these submissions, reflecting an attitude that the government has to now is the time to lock in place difficult decisions. There is, I know, an extended debate amongst economists as to whether the clamps were kept too tight for too long through 1989, 1990 and 1991. Cabinet certainly seems to have held the conviction that this was a recession that Australia had to have, but also a point at which to begin thinking about, a point at which to apply increasing pressure for reform. But into 1991, another angle was becoming more evident in the papers. It was the realisation that in several areas, the recession of 1990-91 was not only forcing through necessary changes, but that it was hitting a society, and especially a labour market, that had not really fully recovered from the recession of 1982-83 and was consequently less well resourced to adapt to the scale of change it was now facing. By May 1991, Keating began to report signs of pickup, but it was becoming, he conceded, more slowly and more patchily than that following the previous slump. Communities were observed to be less resilient than they had been in recovering from the 1983 recession, especially beyond the cities. And as John Button advised in mid-1990 as Minister for Industry, Technology and Commerce, Australian industry in general was at that time much less well placed to accommodate reductions in protection than it had been just a few years previously as a result of exposure to currency and market instability. The burden of microeconomic reform, he added, needed to deal as much with the contextual factors affecting competitiveness, transport, taxation, investment, as with the behaviour of the enterprises themselves. But support for such a program was hard to find. Already one of Button's cherished victories in the previous government lost out when Cabinet cut the research and development tax concession from 150% to 125% in February 1991, one of the many bargains struck in managing shrinking government resources. My point here is, yes, Australia was being transformed. This was making history. That had been the promise. But Cabinet papers into 1991 also began to document the extent of that transformation, with hints of a world that was being lost as much as promises of the world to come. As Minister for Agriculture, John Kerrin pushed for a radical reform of the wool industry through 1990 and gained Cabinet support for that reconstruction, with a sting from finance that, quote, "since price falls are part and parcel of the farming enterprise, why should there be any easing into the full discipline of the open market for wool growers?" But as an extensive drought in eastern Australia began to hit in the second half of 1990, Kerrin observed that, quote, "the farm sector in general is in a worse, less resilient situation than prior to the 1982-83 drought, with the likelihood that," again quoting that submission, "there would be far-reaching consequences in terms of rural unemployment and consequential adverse economy-wide effects if the pace of reform in agriculture was sustained. And while we remember Keren's challenge in having to assume the role of treasurer with Keating's departure to the backbench, we should also look at the script that was put in his hand. Keren's 1991-1992 budget conceded that the past year had been one of, quote, lost jobs, squeezed profits and dashed hopes. Later in the year, he informed Cabinet that unemployment was likely to stay around 10% well into 1993. It fell to Keren to shoulder the extent to which the recession was not simply a cyclical turn, but was beginning to lock down significant structural shifts in patterns of employment and activity that were not quite the brave new world that had been anticipated. Which brings me to my third general point. The world that was emerging in Cabinet discussions of 1990-1991 does, from the perspective of today, look arrestingly familiar. These were, of course, the years of the end of the Cold War, and I encourage you to read Cabinet Submission 6935 of 30th January 1990, Gareth Evans' very upbeat assessment of, quote, the unhindered march from communism to political pluralism in country after country in Eastern Europe under a part benign, part resigned regard for Moscow. Very optimistic view of what the world at the end of the Cold War might look like, even if he was less sanguine about the prospects of re-engaging with the sclerotic leadership in post-Tiananmen China. There were also security assessments, noting that the face and the practice of terrorism was changing in the world at the end of the Cold War, again as the sponsorship of communist states and openly political objectives was giving way in terrorism to the rising threat of radical Islamic groups such as the Abu Nidal organisation. Particularly active in Asia, these groups, it was observed, now tended to, quote, conduct attacks in ways and places which reduce the risk of danger to themselves by highlighting the insecurity of those they threaten, by choosing objects of symbolic and destabilising value, diplomats, officials, aircraft, and so on. This was a new world of terrorism that was increasingly invasive, invisible, unpredictable, and asymmetric. Such asymmetric threat in 1990-91 seemed for the time being to be elsewhere, distant, containable. The blockading of Iraq in response to its invasion of Kuwait offered an opportunity for Australia to gain, through a carefully managed deployment of resources under US protection, a place on the side of the good in the emerging post-Cold War international order, although the National Security Committee was cautioned that the US President George Bush might have a broader range of objectives in, quote, restoring security and stability in the Persian Gulf than Australia necessarily endorsed. And with that deployment, the government's and the PM's ratings soared. This was a profile in the flux of international change that the media and media depictions of it that Australians seemed to like, although, of course, there were questions already being waged about what the new face of computer warfare looked like. Again, a familiar image, a new image of international insecurity and terrorism. Much closer to home was Jerry Hand's determination to end the distortions likely to destabilise Australia's immigration program by the expanding numbers of illegal immigrants then living in Australia. Committed to enforcing, I'm quoting Hand, the first and long-held migration principle that the Australian government will determine who will be permitted to enter Australia for permanent stay, those are Hand's words. Hand warned Cabinet in 1990, look at submission 7148, that in June 1990, that judicial review of individual cases was ineffective in managing the problem of illegal immigrants. The courts, he complained, were taking a very positive stance on asylum. Community compassion, as he put it, was tending in the same direction. Legislation was required to implement, quote, an enhanced strategy to curb illegal immigration and to make it more difficult for illegal entrants to establish a case to remain. No softness, no courting of sympathy for innocent victims of international instability. The options of discretionary detention introduced to deal with Cambodian refugees in 1989 should be expanded. Hand insisted in October 1990 there should be no leniency for those who sought to avoid the queue again, another increasingly familiar word, of people applying to enter Australia under formal immigration processes. A similar determination to insist on Australia's national interests was evident in approaches to the emerging awareness of climate change. Whereas the previous Hawke government had been remarkably open to consideration of proactive responses to global warming, as part of a commitment to environmental causes that had won a significant part of the vote that brought it back into office in 1990, but it still caused deep and open divisions within Cabinet over the tensions between environmental and economic development issues. That third Hawke government had been remarkably open to environmental sensitivities. The fourth term ministry was, however, much more determined to contain the potential of such dissension by establishing firmly and essentially economic principles that would guide judgments on environmental conservation from the start. And a submission of December 1991, number 8476, noted that while Australia must take an active part in the UN's Convention on Climate Change and the Fourth International Negotiating Committee on Climate Change, especially in offering technical advice to other vulnerable nations, Cabinet should be, quote, wary of uncertain science on the issues and the politicisation of their discussion by developing countries. When it came to meeting emission targets, Australia, Cabinet was advised, quote, should not proceed with the adoption of measures which have net adverse economic effects nationally or on Australia's trade competitiveness. Already, Cabinet was developing the case for Australian exceptionalism that would become more central to later positions on such international commitments, although at that time they could still be contained within the crafted language of diplomacy. Familiar stories, the emergence of a familiar world. So, my three core points are, firstly, I encourage you to look closely at the agenda that was being mounted in the cause of microeconomic reform, which perhaps made for awkward politics at the time, but remains central to how we see the longer-term Australian moment, the foundations for the success with which Australia has dealt with subsequent challenges. Second, the government's response to the recession was complex, not just divisive in terms of the right, left and leadership divisions that were becoming so much more a part of government business, but in terms of understanding that transition from an old to a new Australia and accentuating the pressure applied in forcing that change. And third, the new Australia that is so much a part of recent politics on issues such as security, immigration and environmental commitment was already evident in the terms of political and policy debate emerging from these first 2 points. Now, I've scarcely touched the surface of the issues that came to Cabinet in these years, and of course the larger compass of debates within the Cabinet and beyond Cabinet that are so profoundly shaped by the business and fortunes of government are scarcely glimpsed in the records that have become available to you today. The next speaker will have a much better perspective on these matters. But I suppose my concluding point is that the Cabinet papers do give a sense of the disconnect between the vital business of government and the terms of political debate that have increasingly dominated our lives. And they also give a sense of a world that was dramatically changing. Yes, there is the heated debate of August 1990 over the extent to which the market should be allowed to bring urgent modernisation and competition into the provision of telecommunication services, with Treasury's blunt insistence that, quote, the consideration of reform options should not be distracted by community service obligations. But there is also the vision of another submission on the introduction of pay TV and another revolution in telecommunications a year later, which sees a world enabled by localised, diverse, community-oriented, enabling entertainment and information services, and in which it is argued lower income groups will gain substantial benefits in access and expression to services largely funded by the wealthy. That was the prospect, the promise of an increasingly digitised, virtual, interactive, responsive world in which everybody might realise themselves. That was the prospect. Telecommunications in many ways exemplified a sense of how the world was changing in 1990-1991 in terms of the role of government in controlling it, but in terms of the ways in which people would express themselves through that new world. We live with that reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that very fascinating insight. And as you said, it barely scratches the surface. Look, it now is upon me to introduce our main guest for today. But first, I might also acknowledge Ms Anne Henderson, AM, who came in while I was doing my other introduction. Anne is a member of the National Archives of Australia Advisory Council, and it's wonderful to have you here with us today. So, to the main speaker, the main event, the man of the moment. The Honourable Bob Hawke, AC, was born in South Australia in 1929. After completing his education at the University of Western Australia, from 53 to 55 he studied at Oxford University under a Rhodes Scholarship, graduating with a degree of Bachelor of Letters. In 56 he returned to Australia to take up a research scholarship at the Australian National University, and in 1958 became a research officer and advocate with the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU. He was then ACTU president from 1970 to 1980, and during that time was also the president of the Australian Labor Party from 73 to 78. In 1980 he went into federal parliament, and in February 83 became the leader of the opposition. Subsequently led the Labor Party to victory in the general election in March 83, and after winning 3 successive elections, became Australia's longest-serving Labor Prime Minister. He ceased to be Prime Minister in December 1991 and resigned from the Parliament in February of 92. And in August 2009 was given life membership of the Australian Labor Party. Post-parliamentary career has included adjunct professor in the Research Schools of Pacific Studies and Social Sciences at the ANU, honorary visiting professor in industrial relations at the University of Sydney, and membership of the Advisory Council of the Institute of International Studies at Stanford University, and chairman of the Committee of Experts on Membership of the Education International. He's an honorary fellow of the University College of Oxford and holds honorary degrees, numerous honorary degrees from the University of Western Australia, Nanjing University of China, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, University of New South Wales, University of South Australia and Macquarie University, as well as honorary doctorates from Oxford University and the Rikyo University in Tokyo, and was made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 1979. As Nick just mentioned, in fact, in today's commentaries, any sort of discourse about Australia and Australia's future, the word reform keeps coming up, and the urgency for reform. And in every one of those conversations, the Hawke government is cited as an exemplar of Australia's capacity to construct a reform agenda and to prosecute that reform agenda. And so today we are delighted to have Mr Hawke give us his reflections on his time in government, but more importantly, I think, to give us some insights about where Australia should be thinking of going into the future. So would you please join me in welcoming Mr Bob Hawke. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I don't intend to consider in detail very many of the issues and decisions that are covered in the release of the Cabinet Papers over this period of 1991. I've already done that in my memoirs. I don't intend to do it again, and in fact I will be having recourse to those memoirs in the remarks that I do make today. What does need to be done, of course, at the outset is to destroy the myth that has been peddled in some quarters that this was a period of do-nothing government. This myth, of course, was essentially the creation of Paul and his acolytes, who advanced that proposition as a basis for an argument that there was need for change of leadership. This government was doing nothing. We had to have a change. Now, of course, in your essay, Nick, you, in a quantitative sense, have dealt with that, and you referred to it in your remarks. Let me just go to those again. You make the point that, let me find it, where you give the numbers, the record amount of legislation that was passed in the period of 1990-91. I think, without going to it, you point out there was 140 odd pieces in 1990 and about 240 pieces of legislation in 1991, which was more than any other period in Federation. So, in the sort of numerical sense, you destroy that myth, but of course quality is not enough. Quality is important, and I want to go to some independent observations that were made about the quality of that legislation and approach by observers that wouldn't be or could not in any sense be regarded as great supporters of mine. I refer first to, well, let me go to my memoirs, where I really open up this. As I pointed out after the election in March of 1990, I was determined to move ahead, and we did a great deal in the area of telecommunications and waterfront employment reform. And I write in these terms: as this, quote, paralysed government was completing its historic reforms in telecommunications, I was determined in our fourth term to put my stamp on the wider reconstruction of the Australian economy. We had to change from an inward-looking protected entity, either unconcerned with or incapable of competing in the export of manufactured goods and services. We had already brought the country a long way on this road, but in a rapidly changing and more intensely competitive world, we could not afford to rest on our laurels. Garnaut, that's Ross Garnaut, who had been my personal economic advisor when I first went into government, and who I appointed ambassador to China, and who I commissioned to do the report on North East Asia development. Garnaut had provided the signposts and the assumptions in his seminal report, Australia and the North East Asia Ascendancy, presented to us at the end of 1990. I chaired the work of the Structural Adjustment Committee, which directed itself to these issues and included a working session with Garnaut. As a result of these efforts, I was able to make a statement, Building a Competitive Australia, to the House on the 12th of March 1991, setting out the challenges and providing a wide range of decisions, including further substantial cuts in tariffs calculated to achieve my objective. The statement was generally recognised as the most significant of its kind ever presented to the Parliament. Paul Kelly, not famous as my most ardent supporter, described its importance in these terms. I quote, "The major achievement of the Hawke Government in the fourth term was Bob Hawke's March 1991 statement, which stands as an historic milestone. He demolished the edifice of protection, the cornerstone of the post-Federation settlement. It is this decision, providing it sticks, which will guarantee that the direction of the 1990s maintains the course launched in the 1990s. I go on to say that Kelly quoted Garneau's comment that the changes were bigger than the end of the British Corn Laws, which earned Peel and Cobden a dozen pages in our high school history books, and continued. Hawke's announcement effectively terminated Australia's century of protection. It confirms the transformation in politics and economics which his government launched in the 1980s. So I think you can see it was not just a question of volume, of number of things passed, but those totally independent commentators have established the uniquely important impact of those reforms that we undertook in the beginning of our fourth term, which went on throughout this period, that are covered by the release of these papers. One of the things which was particularly important in those decisions we made at that time, and one of the decisions of which I am most proud in terms of its impact at the time and its continuing impact, was the creation of the research centres, a combination of the facilities of the universities and industries. I make the observation here, one of the central elements of the gave effect to the commitment in my 1990 campaign launch to make Australia the clever country. That was a phrase first used by John Dawkins in January of that year. The most specific and what I believe will be the most enduring embodiment of that commitment was the announcement in the statement of the first 15 of the cooperative research centres that I'd promised in 1990. They were the brainchild of my chief scientist, Ralph Slatcher, with whom I had a relationship going back to our student days at Perth Modern School. But this was a marvellous concept on the part of Ralph Slatcher, and they quickly flourished, went on from the original 15 to 50, and they've become a significant feature of the continuing relationship between the education system and our economy. The next factor that I'll just refer to again briefly, which you alluded to, was the new federalism. I have had a thing about our federation for a long time. I gave the Boyle lectures back in, I think it was 1979, and I made the point in those lectures that we had the most absurd situation in this country. All these houses of parliaments and the division of power based upon the meanderings of British explorers across the face of Australia 150 years ago. If you were sitting down today to work out a constitution for this country, you simply wouldn't have anything which remotely resemble the stupidity, and it is nothing less than the stupidity of having a division of constitutional powers today based upon those meanderings of a couple of hundred years ago. And I argued then that the states should be abolished and replaced by central government with strengthened relevant local government areas. But would you believe that politicians, both parties, seem to like the idea of lots of parliamentary seats around the country onto which to park their bums, and were reluctant to see the disappearance of such comfortable positions. And so, as strongly as I argued for the abolition of the states at the time of the Boyle lectures, I really had little chance of persuading my far-sighted colleagues on both sides of the political fence to see the wisdom of what I was about. So what I really was about then in this period was to try and get a new federalism in which we faced up to the realities of the absurdities, if you like, and the inconveniences and the inefficiencies of the present system to get a new cooperative form of federalism. And I made a statement to the House in March 91 to that effect, indicating what I wanted to do, and called a special state conference of the state leaders and the premiers to pursue this proposition. And I would just again quote from independent sources to indicate the assessment that was made by others of the significance of this new federalism approach which I'd adopted at that time. I'd really launched it at a speech at the National Press Club in July 1990, and then we called a special Premiers' Conference towards the end of that year in Brisbane. And I think some idea of the assessment of others about the value of this approach that I was initiating is reflected in, again, in my memoirs. At the end of the meeting, state and local government leaders were unanimous in their praise for the new atmosphere which had been created and for the progress achieved. They were looking forward to consolidating that progress in two further special conferences scheduled for the middle and end of 1991. Independent observers commented that the process that I had initiated and the proposals which emerged were the most ambitious attempt at the practical overhaul of intergovernmental arrangements that had ever been attempted in Australia's near century of federalism. Nick Greiner, Premier of New South Wales, who I may say, although he was on the other side of politics to me, was a marvellously positive, cooperative partner in the thinking and the practicalities what were about then. Nick called it the most constructive thing, quote, that I've ever been involved in, that I've done in 2 3/4 years as Premier, while Joan Kerner, the Victorian Premier, was kind enough to say, "May I, Prime Minister, again thank you for having the vision and the leadership and the patience to enable the conference to happen." So again, you can see it's not just a question of the number of the things that we did, but we were really concerned about looking at the issues which affected the way the country was governed and trying to optimise within the limits, those drastic limits imposed by the structure of our constitution. But of course, the proposed follow-up special conferences to sort of bring about the practical implementation of the new federalism became a casualty of the leadership challenge by Paul, because as part of what we were talking about in the new federalism was the possibility of giving some taxing power, new taxing powers to the states. And of course, in the leadership struggle and arguments, Paul and his supporters posed this as a new threat, new taxation, and so what had looked like a very promising new approach, new federalism, got lost in that process. Now, I'm not going to go on over a large number of other matters, but there are just two things I will go to, and then you'll have the opportunity in question time if you wish to go to other matters. But may I say that one of the great regrets I had as Prime Minister, and I referred to this in my closing comments, I've written about it, was that I, with my colleagues, hadn't been able to do as much as I would like to have done in regard to the question of the situation of our Aboriginal people. We did a lot of things, and I was very moved by the tributes I received from representatives of Aboriginal people when I finished, and when we had the Barunga statement in Parliament. But there is still so much to be done, and I felt that I wished I could have done more. But there was one of the things I hope I was able to do in this period was to address head-on and rather brutally the innate prejudice that existed unconsciously, I think, in some cases, in the minds of so many of my colleagues. And this, of course, came out most in regard to the debates on Coronation Hill, mining at Coronation Hill. It is often thought that that didn't go ahead because of environmental reasons, but the basic argument that I used was the attitude of the Aboriginal people. There were about 300 Jawoyn people there, and they had this belief that their god Bulla, a serpent, existed in the ground but in the area which was proposed to be mined, and that if that was disturbed, the sickness of Bulla would spread and affect them. And when this came up to Cabinet, the proposal that there should be mining, I was annoyed beyond measure by the attitude of many of my colleagues, of their cynical dismissal of the beliefs of the Jawoyn people. And I think I made probably one of the strongest and bitterest attack I ever made on my colleagues in the Cabinet when I was addressing this issue. I said this, and may I say that there is no doubt that this was one element in my loss of the leadership, because there was a great deal of antagonism amongst my colleagues as to the intensity of the remarks I made. But this was something I felt very deeply about, and these are the words I used in addressing the Cabinet on this issue. For 300 blacks, what they express and what they are prepared to suffer for in material terms, these are fallacious mythological beliefs. That's what I was saying, that this is what the attitude of my colleagues, that they were fallacious mythological beliefs. The monumental hypocrisy of this position is mind-boggling. The same people who denigrate blacks in this way can easily accommodate and embrace the bundle of mysteries which make up their white Christian beliefs: the virgin birth, the Holy Trinity, God in his heaven. Where is he? This supercilious supremacist discrimination is abhorrent to everything I hold most important, and to what in the end I believe this party stands for. We can argue about some things, but surely in the end we are at one against the discrimination. The two inquiries are unequivocal in their findings, as the Jawoyn custodians remain in their presentation to your Cabinet ministers today. We would never contemplate reputing such findings if they were in respect of the white community and its beliefs. But 300 blacks are different. You don't want to say it really, but they are talking bullshit. We won't say so, but if we gave the miners another 12 months, put the pressure on them, the poor silly buggers might come to their senses and think like us, or at least like Hewson and the miners. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want any part of that hypocrisy, and I don't want any part of that discrimination. Now, they were tough words, and they were delivered almost with a degree of venom, I must say, because I found absolutely abhorrent, unacceptable, that we could have an attitude on the part of the Labor Party and on behalf of my government and my cabinet, which was discriminating in this monstrously hypocritical way. And mining at Coronation Hill didn't go ahead because the numbers were against me. But from the very beginning of the government, not at my insistence or request, the Cabinet had taken a view that if there was a division in the Cabinet on an issue, the view of the Prime Minister should prevail. And I think with a degree of unhappiness, they maintained that position again, and so the mining did not go ahead, and we were not guilty of that monstrous hypocrisy which I found so totally unacceptable. Now, the other element that I'll go to is in regard to the Gulf War. Before just concluding on the question of leadership, this was a very emotional issue in the government, in the caucus, in the cabinet. We had this tradition of opposition to the war in Vietnam, and people were very, very worried about the concept of going to war again. But this was a case where people listened to argument, and where we had the advantage of a close personal relationship I had with George Bush Senior. He'd rung me early in the piece, and he kept in fairly constant contact. I was able to help him quite a bit. One thing in particular he rang about, he said that as he was getting his coalition together, and this is one of the strengths of the position, that he got a coalition of so many members, including Arab states, he said that Canada was not coming aboard. Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister of Canada, was refusing to come aboard because they had such big wheat markets in Iraq. I said, George, you leave Mulroney to me. So I rang Brian, with whom I had very good relations and who had been a marvellous supporter of me in my leading the fight against apartheid within the Commonwealth Heads of Government. We were good mates. I said, hey Brian, what's this crap I hear from George that you're not coming aboard in regard to getting Saddam out of Iraq because of your wheat trade? I said, we've got a bloody big wheat trade too, but we're in. He said, okay, Bob, we're in too. So George was very, very good about that, and we kept this discussion going throughout the period until we actually went in, and as you know, once the action started, it didn't take long to come to a conclusion. But one thing I appreciated very much in that process was George rang me and he said, Bob, because at this stage that we'd pushed the the Iraqi troops back to their border. He said, "My people are urging me to go on to Baghdad." He said, "What do you think?" I said, "In no way do it. No way." I said, "You put together a marvellous coalition, including Arab states, on the basis of getting them out of Kuwait." I said, "It would be breaking a trust if you were to change the mandate unilaterally and go on to Baghdad." He said, "I'm so glad to hear you say that." He said, "That's my thinking." He said, "We will not go on." Unfortunately, his son didn't inherit his good sense in these matters. So that was a case where, for a Prime Minister, one of the most difficult things the Prime Minister has to do, make a decision as to whether you're going to commit your armed forces to war, knowing that members of your armed forces can die as a result of your decision. But this was a case in which the Cabinet functioned extremely well and understandingly, and I went out of my way to bring in people from the caucus and who had concerns. And one of the most moving speeches I think I've heard was with Jerry Hand, who emotionally was very much against the idea but accepted the necessity of action. It was one of the more moving speeches I've heard. So I conclude by going to the question of the leadership, which, as you've said, permeated this period. I really settled my fate soon after the election in 1990. Those of you who read the story will read that I refused to give Graham Richardson the transport and communications portfolio, something which he'd set his heart on. The background of that was that my dear friend Peter Abels had told me something concerning Graham, which in my judgment precluded him properly being in that position. And because I still have a great deal of affection for Graham Richardson, and because he's in very bad shape, I'm not going to go to that issue because it would be hurtful for him. But I knew once I made that decision to refuse him what he wanted, that he would turn his support and his very, very considerable influence with the New South Wales right to pull, and that's what he did. I don't believe that that leadership tension had a significant adverse impact over this 2 years in terms of achievement, because I think what I've already indicated, what Nick's indicated, we didn't let those things get in the way of doing the things which I believe needed to be done. But I simply accepted the fact when we got to the end of 91 that the numbers were up, and I conclude on this note, I really basically am extraordinarily grateful for Paul, because if I hadn't been thrown out then, I would not have had the opportunity of marrying the woman with whom I'd fallen in love. Thank you.
I would now like to invite questions for Mr Hawke and Professor Brown. So, Nicholas, seated. Give Mr Hawke a moment. Hopefully you're all charged and ready. I'd ask you to please wait for the microphone so that your question is recorded. We have 2 microphones, one on either side of the room. First question here and then a second over the back there.
Thanks. Mr Hawke, Brendan Nicholson from the Australian newspaper. You clearly differentiated between the decisions to go into Iraq the first time and then Mr Bush Jr.'s decision to invade Iraq, the second. Well, how do you see the circumstances now? We've got a very difficult situation, obviously, in the Middle East. The air campaign has contained the advance of the terror group. Do you believe that there's room for further intervention?
Well, let's go back. There was no doubt in regard to the first Gulf War that this was absolutely justified. There was the capricious invasion of sovereign independent country by another, and you had the requisite Security Council resolution condemning it, supporting opposition and armed opposition, sanctions as a first attempt, and if they not worked, then the war. So there's no doubt about the correctness of the first decision. The second was arguably the most massive diplomatic and strategic blunder ever made by any American administration. That is the invasion of Iraq by Bush Jr. I'm not being wise after the event, might I say, because you say you're from the Australian. If you look in your august paper, about 3 weeks before the invasion, you'll see a letter from me in which I said that Osama bin Laden must be on his hands and knees every morning and night praying to Allah that Bush will invade Iraq, because nothing would be more conducive to supporting his cause than such an act. And of course, that is what happened. Every United States intelligence agency in their subsequent analysis has condemned the decision as being counterproductive and adding to the cause of terrorism. Now, so it's important that the distinction between the first and the second be quite clearly understood, and that we understand the magnitude of the disaster involved in that second decision. As to the present situation, the world faces an enormous difficulty here. I believe that it's appropriate that we should be part. Whether we should be such a prominent part is a matter for debate, but we definitely should be part of the alliance fight against IS there in the Middle East. If I can go to a constructive proposition, I believe that until the basic issue in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians is resolved, you're never going to have any hope of any peaceful situation there. I think that President Obama has been inadequate in terms of using his influence and that of the United States in trying to bang together the heads of the Israelis and the Palestinians. I've had the opportunity, through my close contacts with China and in discussions with their International Institute of Strategic Studies, to see that just in the last couple of years China has developed an interest in the Middle East. They've had, the year before last, they had both the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of the Palestinian Authority there in China. My view is that if China and the United States were to sit down together and agree on a process of trying to secure a resolution, that the whole chemistry of the situation would change. Because the simple fact is that the Palestinians in the Arab states simply do not trust America. They just see them as a shield and protector of Israel. But if you had the Chinese and the Americans working together, I think, as I say, the chemistry would change, and you would, for the first time, have a chance of resolving that issue. But we've got to think, you know, outside the box with this issue. It's been going on for so long, and while that's there, it's going to provide a continuing source of inspiration to these terrorist organisations. On the other hand, if that matter could be resolved, then I think you'd be a long way down the track to dealing with the broader problem.
Hello, Mr Hawke. Peter Jean from the Adelaide Advertiser. I wanted to ask you about your recollections of the collapse of the state banks in Victoria and South Australia, which happened in 1990 and 1991 when you were dealing with pretty difficult economic circumstances. How much of a challenge did that pose for the federal government in cleaning up that mess? And did that have an influence on your thinking towards the privatisation agenda at the federal level?
Thinking towards what?
The privatisation agenda at the federal level. Did that influence your thinking on government-owned assets?
Look, I'm just not going to make up an answer to that. I don't recall in terms of a discussion, just what sort of, you know, what the interchange was. I'm sorry, I can't really say anything that's I feel confident about on that. I'm sorry.
Mr Hawke. Yeah, sorry. Mr Hawke, Dennis Atkins from the Courier Mail. Good to see you.
Good. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, you rightly said in your presentation that the leadership tensions at the time didn't affect the business of government, and I think anyone who was in Canberra for that first challenge and saw the way that you and Paul came in and chaired that special Premiers Conference understood that. But there was a criticism at the time that it did affect the communication skills of the government and the ability for the government to get its message across, which then became an issue that Paul used against your leadership. Could you reflect on whether that was the case, and was there, as Nick sort of alluded to in his presentation, some reform fatigue that was in the community, and did that contribute to harder communication challenges?
Well, I must say, Dennis, that I don't have any recollection of feeling difficulties about communication. I think it's fair to say that Paul and I, between us, after 1983, did an enormous job of educating the Australian electorate, getting them more economically literate, if I can put it that way. I think this was an important part of the success of our process. I've always taken the view that ignorance is the enemy of good policy. It's a fundamental belief I've always had. And so I said to Paul and to my colleagues there, and demonstrated my belief by calling it the Economic Summit. And I instructed Treasury that every delegate there had to have the full economic briefing that we'd received when we came in, so that people were infinitely more educated, more understanding of the economic challenges and the changing international environment which we operated. So I think as a result of that, Dennis, the communication became easier. It was not an accident, and I think it was a matter of comment by a number of people that the international observers as to the degree of economic literacy, as it were, in Australia, generally speaking, compared to other countries. So, in terms of your question, I think because we'd done that, I don't think there was a real problem of communication. Looking back, I don't recall having that feeling.
Mr. Hawke, Peggy Giacomellos from SBS in Sydney. Can you hear me?
Speak up, please.
Peggy Giacomellos from SBS in Sydney.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of multiculturalism, how do you think that's changed, or the concept of multiculturalism's changed in Australia since you were in government?
Well, obviously the big change has been the question of our Muslim community. Because of the threat of international terrorism associated with Islamic extremists, there is no doubt that the members of our Islamic community in Australia are subject to greater pressures and prejudices, I think, than ever before. Now, this is wrong. I was saying a couple of months ago, I was having a discussion with some Jewish friends of mine, and they were laying down the law about the Muslim fanatics. And I said to them, I said, remember this. I said, it wasn't a Jewish fanatic that murdered Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel. It was a Jewish fanatic. And I said, the problem is the fanatics of Islam, of Judaism, and Christian fanatics. Because we're going back to what we were talking about, the invasion of Iraq. That would not have happened without the influence of the fanatic Christian right in the United States upon George Bush. So, yes, multiculturalism has become somewhat more fragile for this reason. And I think the onus upon all of us to support our Muslim friends and to ask the leadership of the Muslim community to be as forthcoming as they can in condemning fanaticism wherever it comes from, including from their own religion, the better we'll be. It's because there is no doubt that multiculturalism has been a source of great strength in Australia, one of the reasons for our growth both economically and culturally. And it would be a tragedy if we allowed anything to diminish that.
Mr Hawke, Troy Bramston from the Australian newspaper. Could I ask you to reflect further on the microeconomic reform agenda in those years, particularly around tariff reduction, industry deregulation and privatisation? And I was going to ask you two things in relation to that. Firstly, how difficult was it to get the state premiers to agree with that agenda? But more importantly, I guess, how important was it to get the Labor Party to agree with those changes? There were a number of special national conferences during that period.
Yeah. Well, the premiers were basically okay. I mentioned before I had enormous respect for Nick Greiner. He was economically literate and very cooperative in respect of the issues of the new federalism, recognised the limitations upon good economic and social management that arose from our constitutional absurdities. So here was the Liberal leader of the biggest state, was a very, very positive person with whom to deal. Our own colleagues times were a bit more difficult because the Labor Party is a party which has a long history and the certain, fundamental beliefs which they at times find hard to reconcile with the needs of a dramatically changing world. And of course, the question of tariff reduction was the outstanding example of that. But what I tried to do there, Troy, was to be very practical about it. I said to the Australian community, and I said to the trade unions in particular, I said, if we as a government and if we as a society justify economic change on the basis that it's in the benefit, to the benefit of society as a whole, then society as a whole must accept the responsibility of assisting those who are at the coalface of change. And it's not rocket science. I mean, if something has been done to benefit the community as a whole, but there's a group there of workers in an industry who are adversely affected, then they should be compensated in terms of retraining, relocation allowances and so on. And so you're right in asking the question. There were difficulties, we had special conferences, but in the end we were able to get a positive response, and it is impossible to overstate the importance of the ACTU and the organised trade union movement in this process. One of the things that gives me the shits more than anything else about the Conservative parties in this country is their continuing concerted attack upon the trade union movement. There is no single organisation in this country which has done more consistently over the decades and over our history to improve the standard and quality of life of the Australian people than the trade union movement, both directly through strike action or taking cases in the Arbitration Commission to improve standards, but also in the enormous cooperation they gave to the Labor governments in the war and post-war period with the migration program. Very difficult decision for them, but they supported that. It was fundamentally important to the development of this country. And in the period when we were in office there, they, as you know, through the Accord, made sacrifices in the greater interest. And I think it's ungenerous in the extreme that the Conservative political forces in this country don't recognise the debt that we all owe to the organised trade union movement. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't clean its act up.
Laura Tingle from the Financial Review. Mr Hawke.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to a comment that Nick Brown made, about how Don Russell had said in late 1989 about the economy. You could hear a twig snap.
What?
An audible snap. There was
a snap, yeah.
I'm just interested in, I mean, there was a lot of debate about whether we were having a recession or we weren't having a recession, and that there was this argument that there'd be a soft landing. I'm just wondering at what point in Cabinet's considerations it became clear that, yes, there was a recession upon the economy and that it was a very severe one.
Look, Laura, just let me make a general point and then preface by saying I can't precisely say which month it was, so I won't try and make it up. But the point, I think the important point, Laura, is this, that I think we were not unique. I think most economists around the Western world underestimated the resilience of the market economy after the crash of 1987. It was, you know, a very dramatic crash, and we felt in those circumstances interest rates had to be held down to assist recovery. And I think we all, certainly we did, we underestimated the resilience, and we should have started moving interest rates upwards earlier than we did. But I'm sorry, Laura, I'd like to give you a date, but I can't.
One last question at this point, and if there's a question for Nicholas Brown as well, please.
Mr Hawke, Shane Wright from the West Australian, you were talking about new federalism and a way of the states looking at a new tax base, which was killed off by the events of December 91. We're back having that discussion now about states trying to find a way to give themselves some extra revenue. What do you think they should, what sort of path should they take, and is it possible to win the public over for a change in taxation arrangements between the state and feds?
Now, I have a very strong view that the current debate, the current fiscal debate about an economic debate about how we should go about meeting our fiscal imbalance and so on, is based on totally based on a false premise. Total false premise. Because the debate is based upon the proposition that we have two alternatives facing us. One is reduce expenditure, or two, increase taxes, or a combination of the two. Of course, that's not the limit. The third proposition is new source of revenue. And this is where I am firmly in favour. I'm glad to see Gareth came out yesterday in the paper in support. We should take the world's nuclear waste. Now, I've been advocating this for some time. When in my latter period as Prime Minister, I had Ralph Slatcher, who I mentioned. I got him to get together a committee of world experts, geological experts, to examine the safest remote places in the world for the storage of waste, and they came up with Australia. Now, this is what my Chinese friends call a win-win situation. The world will pay a great deal of money for us to take nuclear waste, and in the process we can transform our fiscal situation. And so I simply say I don't think the discussion that you allude to is in any sense complete or sensible until this issue is looked at.
I think at this point we're running over time now. We do have some interviews, one-on-ones with Mr Hawke and with Nicholas Brown that have already been reserved. I'd like to take this opportunity and invite you all to thank Mr Bob Hawke and Professor Nicholas Brown for sharing with us today their insights, their memories, and also their thinking in terms of now the past, the present and the future in terms of Australian politics. So please thank Mr Hawke and Nicholas Brown.